Asteroids might be one of the most video games that will ever be made. The objective is straightforward and fun. It's got a score counter, it's got clearly defined levels, it's got UFOs. It wasn't the first game to feature a high score screen where you could input your initials, since that honor goes to the 1979 technically not copyright violation Starfire, but Asteroids was hot on its heels. Playing Asteroids is oddly compelling. I tried out maybe a dozen different releases and knockoffs to get B-roll footage here, and every time I told myself I'd just play for a few seconds, and every time I got caught up for longer than I meant to, even while I was playing this one that's on the AARP website for some reason. What's up everyone, I'm Sublight Drive, and when I saw the cover for the Atari 7800 version of Asteroids, I knew instantly I had to build that ship. The cover art here was made by Greg Winters, who was an incredibly prolific artist for video game covers in the 80s and 90s, and you're probably familiar with his work even if you don't know it. He did most of the American Mega Man covers, some promo stuff for Sega, and a couple of Star Wars games, including Rebel Assault and the original Rogue Squadron. He also did all the illustrations for a Star Wars kids book titled... I'm not going to say that, I'll get delisted. You can see a lot of Star Wars influences in these little Delta ships, which is probably what drew me to them in the first place. To get started building, the first thing I need to do is figure out the basic proportions. Fortunately, the ship is a pretty simple construction. It's just a couple of triangles. So once I drew up some shapes in Affinity Designer that looked about right, I cut it out in paper and taped it together. From there, I can go to my cutting machine to cut out the same shapes, but out of Styrene Sheet this time. Once the machine was done, I could get cracking on the first draft. As always, my preferred plastic cement for styrene is Weld-On 3. I had someone ask me in the comments what kind of brush I use for applying the Weld-On since it doesn't dissolve the bristles. My answer is, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that the kind of plastic that brushes are usually made of is nylon, which Weld-On 3 shouldn't dissolve. That said, you could always use a natural hair brush and that would work too. Once the body is together, I can start sketching out whereabouts different details will go on. Now, the main reason I'm doing this is to give me a good idea of how big of a canopy I'll need to scrounge up. I don't have a super extensive collection of clear parts, but this one from my old F-19 kit is a promising candidate. It's not quite right though, so I did the only reasonable thing and bought a brand new Tamiya 148 F-15 Eagle so that I could harvest the canopy. Now, the first little arrowhead I made was a little bit too small for the part that came with the F-15, so I went back to Affinity Designer to draw up some new triangles to cut out. And yes, this did mean I had to rebuild the body, but that was just fine since the first one was mostly just a test to see how things would fit. Of course, I'm not just using the canopy from the F-15 since it came with a perfectly good cockpit, pilot seat, and pilot that are all in scale with each other. Once the cockpit is held in place, I need to make the box that will hold all of the greeblies and vents on the back of the ship. The box itself was pretty simple to assemble, but the vents were more involved. I do love getting to snap out all the little triangles though. Now, in the past, I've gone out of my way to very carefully measure and mark where the individual veins need to go to be perfectly evenly spaced, but every time I do it, I somehow manage to mess it up anyway. So this time I'm just eyeballing it. The veins in the original art aren't spaced evenly anyway, which means I'm just honoring the artist's original vision. Once the vent is in place, I can give the box a little bit more structure and then think about how it needs to be placed. The bottom of the ship has a funky little triangle cutout, so that goes in first. A few little supports give the vent box something to sit on, and then it can go right in. From there, I want to build up around the cockpit to give the canopy something to rest on. I'm actually going to install the glass backwards compared to how it sits on the actual kit, so I need to hack up all kinds of different parts around the cockpit to get it to fit. Now, none of these pieces really fit to the body, so I've got to stick some little slivers of styrene sheet all around to cover up some of the big gaps. And with that, everything is looking nice and unified, but also a little plain. To panelize the surface, I'll start with some half-mil styrene sheet that I cut into strips. As I work here, it's starting to look like I'll end up with shapes that are a bit more exaggerated than on the original art, but that's fine. I'm letting the materials guide me at this point, cutting and assembling in a way that makes it physically easier to line up the parts, but is also truer to the styrene itself. My whole shtick is invoking a Star Wars or 1980s sci-fi aesthetic with my builds, and I think one of the ways I can do that is by recognizing what styrene can and can't do. The folks who were making props for movies in the 70s and 80s were trying to solve all the same problems I am using the same materials, and embracing solutions and shapes that the styrene itself leads me towards is a small but I think significant connection to those artists. To maximize the detail though, I need to add some panel lines, and my favorite tool for doing that is my trusty tungsten carbide scriber. Once the panels were scribed up, I could lay them in place and add some of the larger surface details. I gotta say, it was pretty nice that the original art had both a top and a bottom view, so I actually had some direction for the underside, even if it wasn't super detailed. Next, on either side of the rear are a couple of little boxes with some really tiny details. Now, up to this point, just about all of the styrene I could have been cutting with a hobby knife. The machine just makes it faster and easier. These parts, though, they have such tiny little cutouts that are so close to the edge of the piece that I don't think I could have done this by hand. Or, at least if I did, it wouldn't be nearly as clean. Now, I'm going to add all kinds of engines and etc. to the back, but before that, I want to add more texture to the inside walls. Some styrene strips do a good job of busying up what would otherwise be big open flat areas. And now we're finally at the best part, kitbashing. These are mostly trees from tank kits. I know the brown is from a Tamiya something, and the light gray is a Zvezda tank of some kind. I've also got some biplane engines, battleship parts, an oil refinery kit that's meant to be part of a model train setup. As you can tell, I don't really keep a tight handle on which kits are which. If I'm being honest, most of the time the box and instructions go straight in the recycling bin, assuming that the instructions are even in the box to begin with. About half the kits I buy come from secondhand antique shops. Definitely cheaper than new, but I occasionally end up with a kit someone started building without me. Now, the engines in the back have a kind of funky, rounded rectangle shape, and I've got these little half rounds that will work great for that. Now, when I started putting this together, I had planned on making two, one for each side. But sticking all those little vent pieces along the inside was kind of a huge pain in the butt, and this piece that I made was just a little bit too long. So instead, once I'd finished and the plastic was cured, I just cut the whole thing in half. There you go, one for each side. And of course, I'm not about to skip out on greeblies just because these parts are hidden and in the back. With the main engines all detailed up and integrated into the rest of the ship, I need another little pair of circular auxiliary engines. The central pillars here are styrene tubing, which you can get in a couple of different sizes. These are the biggest I have, I think, and they fit these little pipe caps just perfectly. Integrating these guys is a bit of a trick since they're sort of just wedged in there, but I haven't yet found a styrene problem that can't be fixed with more Weld-On. The underside has a funky little cutout that's just begging for some detail. It actually reminds me a lot of the hangar bay on the bottom of a Star Destroyer, though obviously on a much smaller scale. Finally, I have a few more pieces that I want to just scatter around randomly on the surface to add some more mechanical asymmetry to a design that's otherwise very symmetrical. The very last detail I want to add is some blasters on the front. These are the guns from a TIE Interceptor kit extended with a bit of piping. In order to make the whole assembly fit, though, I gotta carve out a section of the tip. Once it's in, I can better integrate it into the surface with some greeblies. For the finishing touch, I want to add a mount point for a stand. I drilled a hole through the spot I guesstimated to be the center of mass and cut out a bit of brass tubing to slip inside. The brass is not quite a press fit, so some CA glue will convince it to stay in place. With that, construction is complete, but I've been getting my grubby little fingers all over this thing, so a once-over with some isopropyl alcohol is warranted. Before I get to painting, if you've been watching me build this spaceship and thought to yourself, hey, that looks like fun, I want to try it myself, well, good news. I have kits and templates available on my Etsy page so that you can build any of my original designs yourself. I'm also happy to say that I recently dropped the price on my most popular kit, the Atlas. Long story short, manufacturing a kit just takes me less time and effort than it used to, and I'm adjusting the price to reflect that. Oh, and also stickers. Every purchase helps support the channel and my work, but of course, liking and subscribing helps too, so don't forget to do that. Alright, and back to painting. I've put down a layer of gray primer, and the first thing I want to add is some pre-shading along all the panel lines and recessed areas to introduce some tonal variation to the surface. With the pre-shading done, I'm just going to go over everything in a gray that's closer to the color I want for the finished look. The surface is still looking a little plain right now, even with the pre-shading, so I'm going to pick out a few individual panels to paint with a slightly warmer shade of gray. And then I do the same thing with a cooler shade of gray as well. Now, I'd never claimed to be the best in the world at painting cockpits, but I'm not going to ignore it either. Nothing too crazy here, just adding in some spots of color and shading to make it feel distinct from the outside of the ship. Last step for the cockpit interior is just a quick metallic dry brush. Now for the pilot. You can't really tell what he's wearing in the original art, so I put him in a green jumpsuit. But pretty quickly I decided I didn't really like the look of the bright green, so I repainted him into a darker shade. Unlike his jumpsuit, the helmet is clearly visible in the art, and it's orange. So orange it is. Once the pilot was done, it was time to move on to decals. In addition to the F-15 decals I'm grabbing, the whole aesthetic of the ships in the original art just pulls so heavily from the X-Wings, it felt appropriate to use these leftover X-Wing decals that I happen to have. Now, I occasionally have people pointing out in the comments that I should use setting solution for applying decals, and I do. I pretty much always at this point put down a few drops of microset before decal goes on, I just don't usually bother to mention it. So, there you go. I don't always use the micro sole since I'm usually putting down decals on pretty flat or small surfaces, but for these big flat red decals, I will to help them settle into the panel lines a little better. For the finishing touch, these little stripes I'm adding to the guns are, I think, actually supposed to be the detail on top of an X-Wing pilot's helmet. And now, while I wait for the clear coat on those decals to dry, I have a side project to complete. Since I'm making the ship from the game Asteroids, I naturally needed to make an asteroid. Once I have a tinfoil base, I'm using some 2-part Epoxy Putty for this, which unfortunately is very icky, so I'm wearing gloves. That's okay though, since I don't need a ton of precision to do what I'm doing here. Now, this lumpy blob is a good start, but to get the texture a bit more rock-like, I'm going to need real rocks from my backyard. Pressing them into the surface gives the asteroid a much more convincingly rocky sort of look. Once it was primed, I'm going to be painting pretty much the entire thing in watered-down acrylics. First a gray, but then some browns splotched around in different places, black in the shadowed or recessed areas, and after that some more saturated color in a few places. Once all the washes were dry, I put a white dry brush over all the top of it. And then finally a couple of veins of gold mixed in, just for fun. Alright, and with the asteroid done, it's time to turn back to the ship and do some weathering. First, I'm going to go in on the panel lines with a black oil paint, thinned down pretty heavily with mineral spirits so that it flows better. This looks like a big mess right now, but oil paints have a pretty long dry time, so all that messiness is easy to tidy up with a clean brush that I soaked in the mineral spirits. For the exposed mechanical bits, I'm going in with a much heavier hand, since I want this part to really look like it's all filthy and been regularly used, not just in deep shadow. That means I'm being a lot less precise in cleaning it up, too. I'm intentionally leaving a few globs of paint in the deeper cracks or harder to reach spots. The last touch of weathering I'll do here is a few streaks leaking out of this little circular cap. Part of the reasons I really like using oil paints is that they really lend themselves to exactly this, long stains and streaks of oil. With the body all painted up, it's finally time to put the pilot and the canopy in place. I'm using a bit of white glue here to avoid any crazing or off-gassing or whatever the word is for when CA glue leaves all that white crap behind. White glue also dries mostly clear and is easy to clean up with water, so again, a better choice than CA glue here. And for the very last detail, an antenna to go in the back. I waited till the very end to add this because I know for a fact that if I put it on earlier, I would have accidentally snapped it off in like 5 seconds. Now, I loved the Asteroids title from the box art so much that I wanted to include it in some way, so I drew up a vector version and used my cutting machine to make a sticker from some vinyl sticker sheet. In theory, I should be able to use this transfer tape to pick up the letters and apply them to the stand, but the tape wouldn't cooperate, no matter how hard I tried. So I used some masking tape instead, and that worked perfectly. Go figure. And with the text in place, the build was done. This project was a lot of fun to make. I've done quite a few builds like this, taking art and turning it into a physical model, but this one just felt right. Maybe it was because it was a relatively simple shape, or the Star Wars but not Star Wars aesthetic, but I really like how it turned out. If you happen to know of any other obscure spaceships in art from the 80s, I guess let me know in the comments. I'm always on the hunt for new ideas and new projects, and every once in a while art like this will just pop up and my brain just latches on, won't let go until I build it. Don't forget to check out my Etsy page if you want to try making a spaceship of your own. Getting to see everyone's takes on my models is always just the coolest thing ever, and I really do think it's a great way to get introduced to the hobby. If you've made it all the way to the end here, thanks a bunch for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you next time.